Australia has had its fair share of urban legends, from the Picton Tunnels in New South Wales, where people have seen dark figures, strange voices and lights, or Wakehurst Parkway in Sydney that is claimed to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. And there have been many car accidents resulting in deaths occurring along the 14.6 kilometre stretch of road where people claim to have seen strange humanoids and the frightening spectre of Kelly. Kelly appears as a younger girl, who either stands in the middle of the road or appears in the back seat of cars, causing the vehicle to crash. Possibly one of the most famous historical legends is that of Fisher's Ghost, that is an Australian paranormal event that dates back to the early 19th century. The eerie incident occurred in Campbelltown on the outskirts of Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. Today, the town has a large urban population, but at the time of the incident, Campbelltown was a remote rural outpost. The story is about a man called Frederick George James Fisher, who was born in southern England on October the 28th, 1792, and in his early 20s was a shopkeeper. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, Fisher was arrested in 1815 when forged banknotes were found on his premises. He was duly tried and found guilty at the Surrey jail on July the 26th, 1815, and sentenced to 14 years transportation to Australia, which was a harsh penalty for having forged banknotes in his possession, whether guilty or not. In 1822, when Frederick Fisher had served only half of his sentence, he was allowed to apply for a ticket of leave, which gave him permission to purchase a property. So Fisher purchased a farm at Campbelltown. Fisher had a neighbour by the name of William George Worrell. William Worrell was known in the community for being an honest and hard-working man. In 1825, Fisher and a local carpenter by the name of William Brooker had an argument over money, where Fisher pulled a knife on him. Even though Brooker did not receive any life-threatening injuries, Fisher was given a light prison sentence. After Fisher had served his short sentence, he returned to Campbelltown. On the evening of June the 17th, 1826, Frederick Fisher left his home in Campbelltown and was never seen again. He had simply vanished. When the police made inquiries about the disappearance of Frederick Fisher, his neighbour George Worrell claimed that Frederick Fisher had returned to his native England, and that before departing had made him power of attorney over his property and general affairs. Worrell also claimed that Fisher had written to him from England advising him that he did not intend to return to Australia and was giving him his farm along with his belongings. It appears that the authorities had accepted Worrell's explanation, seeing that he was regarded as an honest person. However, 4 months later, things took a strange twist for Worrell when a wealthy Campbelltown farmer by the name of John Farley walked into a local hotel in a state of panic, claiming to have seen a ghostly spectre who looked for all intents and purposes like Frederick Fisher. He said he saw the ghost of Fisher sitting on the rail of a bridge, and without saying a word, slowly raised his arm and pointed towards a paddock down by the creek. And to Farley's horror, the spectre slowly disappeared in front of his eyes. At the time of the disappearance, it was suggested that Farley invented his ghost story as a way of concealing something more sinister regarding Fisher, but nothing could be proved, and the story was never confirmed. Then local residents also claimed to have seen the ghost of Frederick Fisher, who now appeared to be haunting the Campbelltown Town Hall. Apparently, the night that Frederick Fisher vanished, his neighbour George Worrell announced that he was sailing to England because he was concerned about a forgery charge that had recently been made against him. And 3 weeks later, and shortly before sailing, this supposedly honest upstanding neighbour sold Fisher's horse and personal belongings, claiming that Frederick Fisher had sold them to him. Several of the townsfolk had become suspicious, and on September the 17th, 1826, and before he could set sail, George Worrell was arrested on suspicion of Fisher's murder. Worrell pleaded innocent to the murder of Fisher and claimed that 4 men had committed the crime. The 4 men were then arrested. However, 1 month later, on October the 25th, 1826, 2 young boys were walking across Fisher's farm and noticed bloodstains on a fence, and on closer inspection found a lock of hair and a human tooth. A local constable then searched the area, but to no avail. He decided to call in an Aboriginal tracker from the town of Liverpool, 21 kilometres from Campbelltown. The tracker tested the water from the local waterhole in the area and said that it found suspicious remains. After a thorough search, they managed to locate the remains of Frederick Fisher lying in a shallow grave on George Worrell's land. George Worrell was made to stand trial in the criminal court on February 2, 1827, and was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging on February 5, 1827. Just as the noose was being placed around his neck, Worrell confessed to murdering Frederick Fisher, but claimed that it was an accident, believing that someone had gotten into his wheat crop. However, his confession was never believed by the police or locals. George Worrell assumed that because he'd been appointed Frederick Fisher's power of attorney, all Fisher's property belonged to him. But when Fisher was released from jail, George Worrell murdered him in order to obtain his property and all of his belongings. It is believed that John Farley's story about witnessing Fisher's ghost was never used at the trial because anything supernatural would not have been admissible or used as evidence in a court of law, so contemporary police and court records do not mention John Farley's ghost story. The body of Frederick Fisher was buried by his brother Henry at St. Peter's Cemetery in Campbelltown, but no headstone was ever erected. In 1924, an Australian silent movie titled Fisher's Ghost retold the story of Frederick Fisher, and in 1956, a festival about the legend of Fisher's Ghost was organised by Campbelltown City Council and is celebrated to this day. The legend of Fisher's Ghost has since entered popular folklore, and the creek beside which the body was discovered is known as Fisher's Ghost Creek. However, it has since been converted into a stormwater drain.